All right, so welcome everyone to this webinar on leading culture in the 2020s. You can see we've got a number of participants just joining, but I think we'll just get started given it's just after 12. So thanks everyone for making time for this and lunch hour, and feel free to eat your lunch as you watch along and listen along. It's going to be a bit of a presentation, and it's a really practical tips session. So we're not going to dwell too much on kind of what culture is and things like that. I want to really give you some quick tips you can take away straight away to influence culture in your team and in your organization as a whole. There will be a couple of poll questions pop up, so please be ready to jump in and share your thoughts. We're really keen to get your insights on some of these questions. So there's going to be 2 or 3 of those. And also keen to take any questions you might have. And please just enter those questions via the Q&A function in Zoom. And we'll get to those at the end. I'm really keen to hear from you. So please do think of any questions and enter them in there. And I'll try and make a point of addressing as many as I can towards the end of the session. So what this webinar is about, it's really about harnessing culture to drive strategy and change in the 2020s. So the reason we're calling it that is because the 2020s has been a little bit different, and it's shaping up to continue to be a bit different to the past decade. And also, we believe at Blue Seed, the culture is really about strategy and change. It's not just about keeping employees happy and engaged, although that can be a really positive thing for culture. It's also about how you drive your strategy and how you drive change in organizations, which is going to be very more critical in the next few years than in any other time, we believe. So that's really how I'm going to open it up in the beginning. The second part we're going to look at is really practical tips for people leaders and how you can shape team culture. And the third part is around how senior executives can shape their entire enterprise culture. Now, these are really tactical, practical tips, and I'm not going to go into a sort of deep methodology on how to design a culture change program as an HR leader or as a change manager or project manager. But if you're in one of those roles, this can still be really useful, and it could be useful in helping you craft that. Blue Seed has its own culture change methodology, a culture change accelerator, which we might discuss in a future session perhaps. So this isn't about that detailed methodology that we go through as change management consultants to implement culture. It's more practical tips from a change leadership perspective for either a people leader who wants to design or influence the culture of your team, or an enterprise leader at the senior executive level. So that's what it's about today, and hopefully we'll give you some practical tips to take away. So the culture context, well, it's complicated to say the least, and I think it's very confusing for a number of people out there, particularly when I talk to leaders in different organizations at all levels. They're really confused around, for starters, what culture is and what their culture should be. And it's kind of with good reason. When you look at some of these headlines here on the screen, you see there's been a lot of press around bad culture, or the good, the bad, and the ugly, as one of those headlines says there. Particularly with the Banking Royal Commission and other audits of organisational culture and bad publicity around organisations. And it's really become a priority thing at the board level in organisations. Boards are wondering, is our culture what we need it to be to drive the strategy? Is our culture creating risk, or is it mitigating risk in our strategy? And all other risks as well, operational risks, legal risks, and all sorts. So boards are really looking at this with a magnifying glass, as well as all senior managers and organizations as they compete for talent as well. And we're seeing quite a lot come out of Silicon Valley, and most of us hear that. It's really what everyone loves to read about. These startups would become super successful, and they have great margins that they can invest in getting the best people, and they have these great cultures which they really protect strongly and induct people into when they get there. But the other thing you'll pick up from looking at some of these headlines is just how different things can be. If you think about that Banking Royal Commission, and then you look at a place like Netflix, and they have this no rules culture. So that's one of their kind of culture priorities there. And can you imagine what ASIC or APRA would say if one of our big 4 banks had put that on their website as a culture priority for them? Probably wouldn't go down too well. And I love that as just a great example of there's no one size fits all culture. And culture is ultimately about the context which you exist in. And that could either be the industry context, which obviously with the banks is a lot about regulation at the moment and mitigating operational risk. But for startups and tech firms in a highly competitive industry that need to continually innovate and adapt to new technology or new competitors and new customer demands, they're looking at more open-mindedness about rules and trying to break down those barriers and constantly think outside the box. And Netflix on their website tries to explain that, and that it's not about breaking the law or anything like that, but it is about a mentality that they want to take into everything they do. And you see some other things there, like directors boards are all looking at this. Silicon Valley ruined work culture, and that's an interesting article. That came from a point where the Silicon Valley norm has become, you get 3 meals a day there, you get a free bus to work, and you get a ping pong table and bean bags and things like that in the break room. And that became this thing of like, oh, that's the ultimate culture. If you got those perks, then that's going to be a good culture. And so a lot of other firms are taking that lead and think that that's what's going to drive a good culture and make their employees happy. And it hasn't always worked, that's for sure. And some of those perks can be relevant to the culture, like in a lot of the Silicon Valley organizations like the Googles and so forth. The reason they have those things, they want to make it a great work environment, and they kind of want people to stay at work longer, to be honest, and they want it to be an environment for creativity, and that's what they value. And they want to have these breakout spaces and places where people can have conversations and get that creative thinking flowing. And there's a lot more to it than just providing perks. And that may not be the right thing for your organization. Again, I've seen organizations try to put perks in place that often just don't get used. So it can be a confusing context. And one of the key takeaways there is that there's no one size fits all. And it's up to organizations to work out what your context is, what your strategy is, and what you need from your culture. And before you define what your culture indeed should be and what sort of culture you should be driving. So we'll go to our first poll question here. So just give me a moment while I launch that. So the question is, what's your ideal culture? So a few options there. And this isn't a mutually exclusive or even collectively exhaustive list. There's just a few options there, but it gives you a sense of some of the different types of cultures out there. And in our clients that we work with, we see all 4 of these. And even within one organization, you can see different ones. You can see high performance teams over here and a more friendly camaraderie, less challenging team over there. And that might be dictated by even the context which those teams work in. But overall, organizations often have a kind of umbrella culture as well. So thanks for your responses there. I'll just share those results for you. So interesting, you can see there's a bit of a split there. So quite an even mix across all, but certainly a few people liking that high-paced, high-performance culture and the innovative, cutting-edge culture, but plenty opting for the friendly, supportive culture, and a few for the professional, respectful, traditional. So another insight there, it's not just about your context and your industry, which determines your culture, but people have different culture preferences as well. So this will determine the kind of organization which you're successful in. If you're really into that fast-paced, high-performance, results-focused organization, then maybe the organization which is prioritizing more the friendly, supportive camaraderie, it may not be there because maybe they don't give us direct feedback. Maybe they don't challenge each other. Maybe it's not as fast-paced and it's a bit more easygoing. And that might not work for you. And the same could happen in reverse. So it's about thinking about what's right for me when you're actually looking for an organization, but organizations have to set the tone around this type of stuff to determine what kind of people they're going to attract. And be really open and honest about that during the process of attracting and recruiting people. So thanks for your insights there. So why change culture? So again, this is just a list of some example reasons why you might change your organization's culture. And again, it may not be mutually exclusive or collectively exhaustive. And the first one, in fact, is quite a broad ranging one. It's probably the most common. So to align with new strategic priorities. So as organizations implement new strategies, they're looking outside the organization, the market forces, what customers need and want, competitors, technology change, a range of different factors which determines what their strategy is going to be. And as they put in place their strategy, they come up with a range of initiatives, which might be to implement new technology, to reorganize for greater efficiency or for more innovation or whatever those strategic priorities are. And what should go hand in hand with that is an analysis of what do we need from our people in terms of how they work together. Because culture is effectively the combined behaviors of a group. You can say, a lot of people say it's about values and beliefs, and those things do influence what the behaviors translate from that. But they aren't really what defines a culture. What actually happens in terms of people's behavior is what defines the culture. And that's a really critical thing to remember, which I'm going to kind of circle back to as we go through this. So boards and CEOs and their executive teams are constantly thinking, okay, what do we need from our people? And I'll give some examples as we go through this, but there's also a tactical element to this too. And last year, I'll give you an example shortly around how one team that I know responded tactically to what was going on with COVID and the necessity to work from home remotely full time for several months. And that led to them implementing a new culture priority around how to deal with that and how to maintain the communication and collaboration. I'll talk about that in a moment. So ultimately, culture should be about, not just about what employees want and need, but about actually what the strategy needs from employees. So it's kind of a two-way street. The second is a culture turnaround. And this can be when the organization or the culture has become toxic or a negative culture. The majority of the behaviors in the organization are not helping the strategy, or they're causing legal risks or operational risks. Or in the case of some we've seen in the media recently, there's been a need identified by a regulator, by a culture review that's followed that, and by a lot of publicity, which has created a lot of brand damage for the organization. So those are kind of turnaround situations, which are what the banks have been through, whether it's the entire culture has been the problem, or it's kind of the leadership culture, which some argue has been the bank's experience, is sort of the more senior leaders and the culture among those versus the sort of frontline employees. There are kind of multiple culture layers there in the organization, but they effectively have considered it to be in an urgent turnaround situation. So that's how they've approached it, and that's how they've got tons of buy-in, tons of budget to go and make it happen. And that's a kind of culture turnaround situation, or transformation, in fact. And that can also support a transformation when an organization really has to change or die effectively when they're facing that kind of challenge. So it's a really rapid turnaround. The shift to high performance is another one. And often this is part of the strategic priority. So this is sort of linked and overlapping with number one. So often a new CEO will come in, part of their strategy, and this could be a key pillar of that strategy, is to implement a high performance culture. And that means to start allowing some natural attrition, to start trying to work out how they attract the higher performing talent within the industry so that they can compete based on that talent and based on a really high performance culture in the organization. So they might implement a whole bunch of talent management framework practices around that, look at the overall end-to-end talent lifecycle, how they attract people, what's their talent proposition to the market, the recruitment process, the onboarding process, who they reward and recognize, and how people get promoted, and all that kind of thing could become based on a different high performance practice. And that's quite probably less common, but it does happen. The fourth is becoming more and more common, and certainly probably our bias as change consultants, because organizations come to us for this all the time. We see it a lot then, is the striving for enterprise change agility, or effectively a change capable culture, or whatever you want to call it. There's a lot of buzzwords around it. We like to call it enterprise change agility. And that can be just having people who are better at change. So better able to adapt to change. And part of that's always going to be, and what we often work with clients on, is looking at their systems and processes and all those things that build what we call change capability assets. And you can read about those in another white paper and a webinar we did last quarter, in fact. But a part of those change capability assets is your people and your culture. How change capable are they? Do they thrive in change? Do they go looking for it? Do they seek it? Or is there significant resistance when the big change hits? So that's the fourth one, which we see quite a lot of demand for that at the moment. So we'll go to a second polling question here. So this one will be interesting. Just bear with me. So based on what you just heard around those types of change or types of culture change scenarios, what type of culture change does your organization need? Or does it need a change at all? Is it something where you think the culture is great, it's really supporting your strategic objectives, everyone loves coming to work, there's great alignment between people, culture, strategy, and what's going on in the organization? That might be the fifth option there. Great, quite a few responses there. So I'll end the poll, share that. So top one, alignment with new strategic priorities. And that doesn't surprise me because that is probably the most common and widespread. But interestingly, we've got, I think, one response down the bottom, the culture's perfect. And I would have expected that to be about close to zero, but one's not too high. Quite a few looking for change agility and a spread across all of them, which is really interesting. Again, it just shows every organization's facing different challenges, or at least people have different perceptions of those challenges. So that's quite interesting. So to get us into the tips now, I'm going to share some tips, first of all, for people leaders. So these can be applied to anyone who's a people leader, or it might not even be for people leaders. You can instigate this in your team with your own one-up manager and do some of these practices as a team, or you can do it with your own direct reports as well. It's really just about any team, effectively. So culture isn't just up to leaders at the top or in middle management or anywhere else. But leaders do have a great influence, not control over culture, but they have a significant influence. And some of the best cultures, the best places to work are where the leader knows that and they go and live it. They know, hey, I'm a leader, I want to influence the culture. And, they'll consult and engage and involve people in defining and creating that culture, but they really play a key role in sort of being the rider of the horse. You're not just letting it be a wild brumby, as I say in an article we wrote last quarter on this. You're really taking the reins and being that force for good in your culture, or force for change. So we're going to start with tips for people leaders. And then I'm also going to share some tips for executive leaders. So senior executives on shaping enterprise culture as well. Now, I'm not going to share all the tips. I wrote a 3-part blog series last quarter on this, and we've just published it as an ebook online on our website. So you can get a few more of the tips there, but just in the interest of time, I'm just going to share a couple here. Now, the other thing I'd call out just before getting into it is ideally you will have a clear and lived culture across the enterprise. So the whole enterprise kind of knows what the culture is about. They know what it stands for. They know what it looks like in practice, and it's really clear, but you don't always have that. And I know a lot of organizations out there, some of you on this call are thinking, not even really sure exactly what that culture is. I could describe it, but the next person might describe it differently in a different team. And you might think, well, I've got values on my website, but we don't even talk about those. We don't even know what that looks like in practice, and it can be a bit blurred. But it's okay to start just with your team, and that's why we've got these tips, not just for your whole organization, but for your teams as well. So it's a good place to start. So the first tip is to identify and agree current and relevant culture priorities. Now, there are 2 parts to this. The first is a shared belief, and the second is a corresponding observable behavior. And that's what it looks like in practice. Now, too often in organizations, they go through a process where we need to do culture as part of our strategy thing. We'll just come up with a bunch of values, and it's often integrity, communication, innovation, and these kind of off-the-shelf things. We'll stick them on our website. They get signed off by the board. We might stick them in the hallways, and that's the job done. The culture's done, right? Or it's communicated out, and we want everyone to go and live by these things. But people don't actually know what they look like in practice, because one person looks at integrity and thinks, oh yeah, I know what that means. Another person looks at it and they see something else, or they see different practices in different contexts, like how it shows up in a meeting, how it shows up in an interaction between 2 people. So the most critical element of this is that corresponding observable behavior. But also I would say around the shared belief is that it has to be unique to your organization and what it needs. People have to look to it and feel like it's meaningful and relevant to what's going on in your strategy, what's needed right now. And it also has to be not just what it is, but kind of an aspiration around what we're striving for. And that's when people look at it and they feel inspired and motivated, and they feel like they've got to actually put effort into achieving it and to living that belief. It's not something which is second nature. So integrity is one of those things, or innovation, collaboration. You can see those words and you think, oh yeah, well, yeah, we do that already. You know, don't need to worry about trying that out. But when you outline a shared belief, which is more aspirational and harder to achieve with clear corresponding behaviors around what that looks like, it changes the game a little bit. So I'll share you just to really bring that to life. I'll share with you, this is a team I know, a client organization, who, when COVID hit last year and they had to go to remote work, and they were concerned about how they were communicating and how it was going to drive results through those long periods, many weeks where they're having to work remotely. So they came up and they got together and they talked about their culture, and they came up with this culture priority. So they started with the belief, they actually called it something different, but they were following this basic methodology. They started with this belief that our communication lines are open, honest, and drive action. And now this is quite a high performing team. And you pick up on some words in there. They didn't just say we're going to communicate well, right? It's not as abstract as that. You get a few hints about what they're about by looking at this. So they want it to be open and honest. So open, showing this kind of real flows of communication. There's no sort of radio silence. Honest is in, you know, they tackle issues and they talk about how they're working together and how they're going, and being really authentic around that. But drive action. So it's showing it's not just about that kind of empathy and being really human, but it's actually, we need results. We can't just slow down. We can't stop. We can't drop the ball on this. So we've really got to drive that action. So you can see these are some of the observable behaviors. I've sort of paraphrased here. Now you see that it gets pretty specific. So that they drive accountability and performance, but empathize and forgive when needed. So it's got that sort of soft and hard side to it. But then it goes into detail around preferred communication methods as video calls, second preference is phone, third is Teams chat, fourth is email. And some really strong commitments that really show that they're going to live this belief, and that people are going to know what it looks like, because it's pretty much measurable, right? We return calls and messages within 90 minutes, even if it's just a text message to say, I'll be free at 4 p.m. or I'll be free at this time. I've got back-to-back meetings, can't talk right now. You get back to them and let them know. We return emails within 48 hours if it's urgent call or text message. So you can see those really specific things about it. So people know what it looks like. If you just had that belief, people wouldn't know what it looks like. They wouldn't have those clear metrics on which to judge their behavior and to decide, okay, are we doing this or not? So then one person might say yes, one person might say no, if you didn't have those observable behaviors. So it's really key to articulate that. And not just write it down and share it and stick it in a drawer and a file, but to actually talk about it and get everyone to sign up. Yeah, I'm good with that. I'm down with it. Or if someone has a problem with it, tweak it and adjust it and just work out what's reasonable. But the other part you can see there is that it's really aspirational. You can see that to return calls within 90 minutes, even with a message, that's quite challenging for anyone. But it is achievable if you commit to it. And it requires that aspirational target. And look, if you don't hit it every single time, it's not the end of the world. That's why these things have to be aspirational, probably more so than actually completely realistic and achievable. And that's what's going to drive the right culture. I'll give you another example. This is from Netflix. Now, Netflix, you can look online and see they basically have this epic culture manifesto. It's around 4,500 words long, and you basically get to know that culture inside out before you even set foot in the door as a new employee. They make sure you know it, and you probably want to know it before you even go for your first interview there if you're an employee. They're very clear about what they expect. And you see some of the unique language in there. So they say, things like all great companies, like all great companies, we strive to hire the best and value integrity, excellence, respect, inclusion, collaboration. So it's sort of calling out that those things are a baseline. But then they use this language, what is special about Netflix? And this is really the key part of your culture and defining it. And it outlines these things. And you see some stuff in there that's just not going to work for other organizations. As I said before, the avoid rules piece. keep only a highly effective culture. They have a culture of firing people regularly. It's kind of brutal, a little bit scary and daunting for a lot of people. But it's really showing that that's what it's about. They kind of want turnover of talent. They kind of want fresh ideas coming in, and they don't want low performance. They don't want people dropping the ball. And a lot of people who go in there kind of accept it. They even have meetings where people turn up and say, you know what, I think I need to be fired this week because I made this mistake. And they might say yay or nay to that, you know, as a team. It's that open and honest and clear about performance. And people are often happy to leave because even if they got 2 or 3 years experience there, it's great for their CV probably anyway. Extraordinarily candid, you know, using language which is really aspirational and showing that this is different to other organizations. Another one there, you can see freedom and responsibility. Sounds abstract on its own, but when you see the description, they actually, there's many paragraphs to these. These are just small snippets, but they use metaphors like this one of, you know, companies where people ignore trash on the office floor. We try hard to be better, you know, taking care of problems small and large and never thinking that's not my job. So metaphors are really powerful kind of symbols of culture and makes it easy to remember these things. And people talk about this when they're walking the halls. Another one, highly aligned, loosely coupled, you know, super jargony, but then they give really specific examples of breaking it down to see what that looks like, you know. Like, as you can see there, we spend lots of time debating strategy together. We trust each other to execute on tactics without prior approvals. Often 2 groups working on the same goal won't know of or have approval of their peer activities. If later the activities don't seem right, we have a candid discussion. You know, it's getting super specific. Like, these are the scenarios where our culture shows up, and this is what we use as a guide to our decision making. And as you can see, there's another 4,000 plus words on their website. And it's not just their website, it's not just documented, it's not just a few words defined, stuck on a wall and forgotten about. They talk about this stuff constantly. They review it, they have meetings to discuss it, they integrate into all of their meetings. And so people are never forgetting what they're about. So that leads to the second tip, which is to regularly discuss how you're working, not just what you're working on. And this is really fundamental too. To define your culture, it's not just a one-off exercise, although most organizations believe it is, and that's how they behave. What's really important is that you continually integrate it into everything you do. You circle back on it on a regular basis, and you ask these kinds of questions, the how questions. How are you collaborating? How are you managing yourself day to day? How are you feeling about work at the moment? How could we be doing better in the way we're working together? How could we be serving each other's needs? And how well are we living our culture priorities? You know, where are we failing? Where are we doing well? And let's assess ourselves against that, just as we would with any sort of performance goal in an organization. So the how is really important. And I think most of you out there probably have regular status meetings where you talk about what you're working on. And there might be some cross-pollination and help that comes from that, and that can be useful. But it's amazing how many people shy away from talking about how they do things together. And they're worried about how tough the conversation can be, I think, or their culture's just not used to talking about it. And people are worried that they're going to have different views on it and so forth. And there is going to be that challenge there. When you're driving change in an organization, as any leader out there or change practitioner will know, you come up against resistance, and none more so than when you're trying to drive culture change. So it's about, as a leader, having the conviction and the confidence, the courage to really tackle that and be okay with that resistance and work through it together with people to discuss how you're working, and then try to come up with an optimal way of doing that in your culture priorities. So provide extra support for new starters. So you've got to be really careful who your new starters are getting inducted by, and you've got to have a structured process to it, and most organizations do. But now in the COVID world and the hybrid work world, this is even more of a challenge. People can get lost working from home, or it's harder, it takes longer for them to be inducted into the culture. And also the other thing when new starters, even in the face-to-face world, new starters will kind of join an organization, they'll meet a lot of people and get to know people, and they'll probably fall in with certain people and not so much with others. Often high performers, for example, will look at the most high-performing person. They'll look in there at the leader or their peer, someone who's knocking it out of the park, the person that gets all the recognition, the person that's getting the promotions and the bonuses or whatever, who looks like they're killing it, right? And they'll model themselves on that person. So you better make sure that that person is living the culture that you want. And often that's not the case. Often people get promoted for financial performance and other things, but not for what the target culture is, and there's a misalignment there. So it's important to make sure, I mean, ideally in a strong culture, people will get integrated pretty clearly because everyone's sort of living that culture. But often it's not the case. Often there's multiple cultures and different teams and different interpretations of it in people's minds because they don't have those clear cultural priorities. The corresponding behaviors aren't clear. And sort of you're leaving it to chance a little bit with new starters when you don't have that. So it's important as new starters come in that you really think about, let's talk to them about how we work and what the expectation is of them, and be really, really clear about that with them. So that's just a few tips for people leaders. There's more in the article, as I said, online. I'll talk now about some tips for executive leaders. So I think now, this is just my view, that it's time for executives to really double down on culture. With what's going on, at least in Australia, and probably this would apply just about anywhere, the COVID recovery is happening, but there's certain changes that are remaining in place, things that aren't going to go back to the way they were. We're going to live in a more hyper-connected world, the work from anywhere, hybrid work, and there needs to be different approaches to managing and leading culture. Again, it's about leaders exerting influence, not control, but trying to take the reins and figure out how they can influence culture to be what it needs to be. And some of that's going to mean decisions around, like, I know some leaders are thinking they've got to get everyone back to the office for their innovation and collaboration and connection and that type of thing. And that might be the case. You might need decisions around that, which can influence your culture. But also you've got to think about, how can I influence culture, you know, even remotely as well. So influencing culture at scale, by the way, generally, if you're changing the whole culture of an organization, there's a few really important things to know. And the first one is that it takes time. It can be really time consuming. It's slow to move. Changing people's behavior is a really, really time consuming process. You can't just send out one communication and expect it to happen. It's going to be something which needs to be chipped away at over time. And ideally looking at things in the talent lifecycle, in the example I gave earlier, and having a really structured culture change process around that, and way of engaging all leaders at all levels so they understand what the target culture is, what the current culture is, what the gap is, and how to fill that gap and how to progress on the path to that aspirational target state. You've got to have all that sort of stuff. And we do that for organizations using our culture change methodology. But there are certain things you can do as an executive leader straight away. So I'm going to talk through a couple of those things right now. The other thing just to point out is you need that really structured change management plan to get from A to B. But let's go through some of the tips that leaders can do, executive leaders can do straight away. But before I do that, let me just give you another example of kind of enterprise culture change. This one's at Foxtel, an Aussie company, obviously. And I think everyone kind of knows the change story here a little bit, but you know, and it's a great one of an example of what I mentioned before around how the market influences what you need to do as a culture. So the old market with Foxtel was, you know, they're incumbent, pretty much the only pay TV or subscription TV provider. So low competition, customers were willing to pay, you know, $100 plus a month for a number of channels. Technology was pretty limited. They used a couple of ways of doing that, but it wasn't easy for new competitors to enter the market because of that. So there was limited options out there for customers. So the culture was defined by quality. They wanted a quality service, you know, the IQ boxes, lots of options, and really prestige in what it offers to customers. Really careful, quite bureaucratic it became over time, as all organizations do if they're not careful. Unchallenged by our competitors, you know, quite product centric, and a slight aversion to risk. So the new market forces that came around, obviously Netflix is the big one, which happens to be the other example I gave, entered the market, and as did a number of other streaming services. So it became hyper competitive, all about low cost, new streaming technology, and on demand from anywhere. So not just on your TV, but on your laptop, on your mobile, tablet, and so forth. So that brought around a whole transformation of the sector. And obviously Foxtel had a transformation that's spanned a number of different things, you know, from technology, systems, processes, operating models, you know, rationalization of hardware, systems, everything. So there's a lot of different paths of transformation, but there is a new culture priority there. And those who've worked there and those you talk to who have worked there will tell you that it's now more about innovation. It's more agile, it's more rapid, And it's more about efficiency and cost minimization, because that's what customers are demanding. They need that from their product, which means the organization has to be that as well. So pace to market, pace to put new content out there. It's really customer led. So it's really tuning into what customers need and just providing the services they need. So now Foxtel's has offered new offerings like KO and Binge and different streaming methods for its existing Foxtel service as well. So it's an example of how that culture has changed as a result of a transformation, which is a result of what's going on in the market. So the first tip for senior executives I can give at the moment is to engage junior members directly to broaden your perspective on culture challenges and opportunities. A senior manager at a Big Four bank gave me an example of this recently when through COVID, she said in the office, she used to speak to an executive general manager who's 2 or 3 levels above her. Several times a week, they'd bump into each other in the kitchen. He'd walk past her desk, they'd chat, have a good chat and share what's going on at her level, what's going on at his. He'd talk about, the strategy, and he'd even come out of some tough meetings and be really open and honest about what those were like. And she'd learn a lot from that and get a lot of insight from him. But he'd also get a lot of insight from what's going on from her. And he would wander the halls and talk to people. And he was that kind of leader that would do that. Then COVID hit. Everyone went to remote work. 9 months later, she hadn't heard from that executive at all. They pretty much lost connectivity. So there's a big disconnect. There's a risk of that disconnect between these levels in the organization. And we're sort of reverting back to what's almost like a hierarchy where it's that middle management filters there, and senior execs are often not hearing from their junior people, and vice versa, unless it's just via email that comes from the top down. So, and that can present a few challenges. Another example of where it's done well is, I heard on a podcast recently, the CEO of Elders, an agribusiness company, Mark Ellison, he's really big on culture, and one of his sort of quirky habits is to just go through the directory of the organization and just randomly call someone. And he might do that once or twice a week. And often the employee on the front line, who could be out there anywhere, their employees are spread around regional Australia and city centres as well, would be surprised and kind of taken aback to hear it, and often question on, that's not really you, is it? But then they'd be really pleased to hear why he was calling. And he would be asking us these kinds of questions, what's getting in your way? What's the biggest barrier to teamwork at the moment? How can I help remove those roadblocks? What can we do to build a better culture in the organization? Are there any culture problems you see? Are there any sort of toxic people causing you problems? They'd be really open and honest about it. Questions like, if you were the CEO, what would you aim for in our culture right now? What would you change about it? What frustrates you most? And having those kinds of conversations, and the CEO would often take actions and say, look, I'm going to try and address that for you, and I'm going to take it into account, and I really appreciate your time. And that employee would walk away, tell their friends and peers about it, and say, I just spoke to Mark, this is what's going on, I told him these issues, and everyone would kind of be amazed, and that person would be really engaged. And the CEO would also just get that hardcore knowledge about what's going on direct from the front line. Really powerful force. So it's really powerful for executives in diagnosing what's really happening on the ground. And doing it one-on-one is quite useful. You tend to get a more open, honest conversation. No one holds back, particularly when the CEO approaches in a right way with that kind of sense of psychological safety. No matter what you say, you're not going to be punished. I just want to listen. I'm here to help. So that really helps as well. And it can also help the CEO gauge, or any senior executive gauge, how likely people, if you're thinking of changing the culture and doing something, you've got something in mind that you want to see more of in the culture, you can kind of stress test that with people, or just get a sense of where they're at, and that'll gauge how it's going to land if you go out and try and change the culture. Is it going to land well, or is it going to be a tough thing for them to swallow at the moment? For example, you might be thinking in your own mind, looking at strategy, going, wow, we've got to move faster, we need to move at pace, the competition's catching up. But then you go and talk to one of your employees and they say, you know what, we're overloaded and we can't keep up and the pace is just insane. And so if you'd gone out and said that message to them, that probably would have been really a problem for them. It might have actually led to burnout and just not being feasible. But if you've gone out and found out, well, what's stopping that pace? Are we not prioritizing effectively? Are we doing too much of this, not enough of that? And have those conversations directly with people, then you might be able to meet in the middle, or you might be able to remove some of those roadblocks and come up with at least a better message around what the culture priority should be or what's feasible. So stay in touch with your people on the front line. The second is to identify, obviously, as we already talked about, but communicate policies and current relevant culture priorities. So obviously with COVID, I mentioned policies because it's so important at the moment. You've got to have sort of baseline policies around working from home, working in the office, you know, social distancing when that comes in, how you respond to crises if there's an outbreak, all that kind of thing. And those policies have got to get out there quickly, but also relevant culture priorities. So as I said before, one of the biggest problems is culture is seen as a bit of a tick box exercise, and to find these values and stick them on the wall, you forget about it. It has to be more than that. It has to be talked about kind of in everything you do and referred back to. And you can do that in a number of ways. Like I've seen a lot of firms using video, and one organization, a client of ours, upped their video capability last year pretty early on. They went and got a couple of extra video experts and video cameras in for a number of different purposes. They just knew that they were going to need that more, but senior executives actually jumped on it and started getting in front of the camera. And a few were pretty hesitant at first, but then at one point when I checked in, those cameras and that video service within the organization was booked out because so many leaders were using it, so many team members were using it for different purposes. And that was actually a big boost to the culture. And it showed leaders, you know, talking from home, sometimes just wearing a t-shirt, maybe a kid's in the background or something like that. And they're just talking openly and authentically about what's going on at the moment, what the priority is, how do we communicate effectively, how do we need to collaborate, what's our culture priority at this moment in this period that we're going through at the moment. And that could be quite powerful. So leaders have to live it, and they have to find a way to get out there and talk to it in unique ways as well. So I've got one more poll question here. So bear with me while I just load that up. Okay. So the question for you is, what is the go-to culture shaping channel of executives in your organization? What do they tend to use the most, if anything? It might be a bit of a hard question to answer, but it's probably where you see the culture referred to, or where you see these symbols of culture. Is it just the weekly newsletter? Is it, you know, do they have town halls? Is it left up to each individual manager? Is it completely organic and no one seems to be managing it, it just sort of happens? Or is it something else? Give another moment for a few more responses to come in there. Couple more coming in there. Thanks for that. I'll end it there. So there are the results. You can see a range again, but the events, all hands forums, virtual video, telecom is a key one there, which isn't surprising. Quite a few for email, and that doesn't surprise me.
Sorry, Huw.
Yeah.
We just can't see the results right now.
Oh, sorry. Thanks, Tommy. There we go. So you see, yeah, live events, big, quite a few through email. Quite a lot's left up to individual managers, and a few there saying it's organic and it doesn't seem to be managed, and that's not uncommon. So I think those events actually are quite a positive way to bring the culture together at an enterprise level, and it really helps you get rid of that or sort of circumnavigate that middle management filter, so executives can really speak openly and honestly directly to people and hear from them. So I think that's really a great thing. I think the important thing is that you want it to be integrated through all, and obviously this question isn't going to bring that to life, but hopefully in your organizations it is integrated through all. If it's not, it's good to find those ways. How do you get it in each manager's head when they're talking to their teams? How do you get it into forums? How do you get it included in emails? You know, in other creative ways as well. There are lots of different ways you can do that with some creative kind of interventions. So just an interesting insight into some of the differences out there, different preferences in organizations. So the other tip is, and this will probably be the final one, I think, just in the interest of time. So to lead through authentic communication, empathy, reality, but also directness. And I like to emphasize that one. I think empathy has been a really big thing over the last few years, and I really like it. And I think it's great. I think it's also important that we don't lose sight of being open and honest and direct. So when things happen, so often I see in organizations, as I touched on earlier, people are afraid to raise things, afraid to call stuff out. And often it's because they don't know what's acceptable and what's not, because you haven't identified the culture priorities and behaviors, and people aren't clear on that. So that can be a big part of it. So they actually don't know what to call out and what's wrong and right, because they haven't written it down and agreed to it. So that's obviously an important step in being open and honest and direct, but really just having the courage and doing it in the right way, where it is done respectfully. It's not done in a blame way. It's just questioning, or it's, saying it and being really clear and saying it in a way that shows that you have the right intent, and it's about the organization, it's about the team, it's not about me versus you or anything like that. So sharing that open and honest feedback is really, really important. And I think that's one of the best things you can actually do as an executive, is to actually role model this by asking for feedback. One of the great things to do as a people leader or executive, or anyone really, is to go and ask people in organizations, say, hey, how do you think I did in that presentation? Hey, what do you need more from me in our one-on-ones? What would you like to see coming out of the head office more frequently? What sort of updates do you need? And, asking those questions where it's self-reflective, being open to hearing it. And when you ask that sort of stuff regularly, you'll find your people will be more open to hearing feedback as well. It's a two-way street, and that's a really powerful force, powerful thing for leaders to really go and role model. And this will help, free up those communication lines where you're talking about how you're working. And that is utterly important to creating whatever culture you're trying to achieve. So it kind of is a hallmark of an ideal culture, because without that, you can't achieve any kind of culture. It's not that there's one that is part of one ideal culture. It's kind of almost a dependency to achieve any culture, is that really open kind of feedback. So I guess the headline there is really that leaders must be open to listening, but also embrace their role as a powerful influencer. And probably that's one of the key messages I'd leave you with today, is to think about how you as a leader, whether you're a senior executive, a middle manager, maybe you don't have any direct reports, you can still be a leader of culture, and think about what is it that you can do right now to go and influence your culture, to shape it into what it needs to be. And maybe it just starts with having a conversation as a team about what do we need to be as a culture? What are our culture priorities right now? And what would you like to see in it? And allow others to share their thoughts in that too, and try and come to some sort of agreement on what the best practice is, the aspirational culture for you. So what's next? I'll take some questions. If you've got any questions, please put them in the Q&A. I can see there's at least one there. If there's any others, please put them up there, or even reach out to me offline. I know a lot of you probably have my contact details, or you can look at our inquiry line. I'm more than happy to keep talking about culture anytime. But what's next? So our culture ebook, as I mentioned, is online. It's been loaded up on our website now. You should be able to download that. You don't have to enter your details or anything, or pay for it. Obviously, it's just free. And that's basically has 3 chapters on a lot of the content we talked about today, but a lot more as well. And that's a great resource to share with your peers. Upcoming, we've got another article coming up on transformation leadership, which is going to really examine the tough decisions and kind of harsh realities that transformation leaders face. I'm really excited about that, and I can't wait to share that with you. I think there's so many people out there that could benefit from that, and it's going to be reassuring, particularly for those out there who are leading a transformation initiative. So stay tuned for that. But before we go, I'll just look at some of these questions. If I can find the Q&A box. How do you encourage a hybrid attendance culture when people get comfortable at home? Yeah, look, I think that's one of the questions on everyone's lips at the moment. And I think it's about ultimately, it's a learning experience for everyone. And I think that's a really powerful thing to take away, is we have to think about, well, why do we need everyone back in the office? What's really the benefit to that? Because when you're driving any kind of change, there's 2 things that need to happen. First is there's a lot of things that need to happen, but 2 key things that need to happen is people need to feel unsatisfied. They need to be dissatisfied with the status quo, and they need to see a reason for the target. So if we're trying to the target is to get people back in the office, what's in it for them? What's in it for the organization? And being really clear about that. I think at the moment, that isn't really clear. I think a lot of people are seeing a lot of what's in it for them to staying at home, particularly in the big cities like Sydney and Melbourne, where you can avoid a commute. You might avoid an hour and a half, 2 hours of travel each day, and getting ready and all those sorts of things. And that's a pretty powerful what's in it for me. So we need to think about, what's in it for people for coming back in the office. And I think creating a new experience of the workplace is going to be imperative. I've got a friend of mine is actually a workplace change management executive. So he works with a big property company which designs workplaces, and he's saying there's going to be a lot changing in that space to make the workplace experience something where you want to go, where you actually kind of want to get out of home occasionally and you want to go in there. And I think that workplace experience is going to change. I think a lot of organizations are going to be looking at that at the moment. And I think the other thing that's worked really great, just in our firm was pretty good with the remote work because we were always, as a consulting firm, working from anywhere. We work in client sites, work from home already. We worked in the office. So we're kind of a blend, but we end up being more home. The thing when we started getting back to the office, we made a point of doing is really having a lot of connection as a team. So making sure we all have lunch together. We're doing fun events. We're doing more social activities. And as I said, that isn't critical to culture. But it does encourage people to come in and get that connectivity because you're giving them a great experience and making it worthwhile. So I think leaders need to really think hard about, why do we need people in there? What's in it for the business and the team? And sometimes you've just got to draw a hard line under that and have a policy around it, which is really a baseline. And a lot of organizations are starting to do that. But other times you've got to really kind of give them a really good reason to come in and a reason to do that because there's lots of benefits to staying home as well. So that was one of the questions. The other question there is actually just a comment. So thanks, Stu. Said he needs to jump off. Great session, very timely. Thanks for that feedback. Stu, I know you've dropped off already, but actually there's some in the chat, I think. A few thank yous, tangible experiences, great example, good stuff. Another one is how are companies encouraging work culture at home while still encouraging switch off time, i.e. the workday is crept earlier and later affecting burnout. Yeah, this is a great one. Actually, one of our team, when we had a bit of a culture, or we had a session where we talked about our personal habits and rituals and things like that last year as we went through COVID. We talked about a number of different things, and I actually talked about one of mine, which is to have a cold shower first thing in the morning and put on a collared shirt, and that was one of my things. And no one seemed to want to adopt that in our team, which isn't surprising. But one thing my colleague Cheryl said was that it's kind of work from home, but it's also living at work. And so it's a two-way street there. So having that always on culture. And I think, I know personally, I've worked out new habits around that. But for me, I think it's different for everyone. And sometimes you have to accommodate people on this. But it's worthwhile helping people work out what works for them. I think it's just part of the new normal with personalized flexibility. For me, I really adopt a work-life integration. So I don't mind working outside hours as long as during work hours, I can do other stuff when I need to do it. I went to a parent-teacher evening for my daughter at her school, in the mid-afternoon on Tuesday. And, last night late at night, I was working on a few work things as well. So for me, that's what works well for me. It doesn't work well for other people, and other people need the clarity and the boundaries. And I think it's just up to leaders to have that open conversation around what works for the employee and for the team, and to try and bring that together. All right, well, that's a few questions answered, and I think we're coming close to the end of our time. So thanks for everyone for joining. If you have any questions or comments, we're going to send a few of these insights, follow-up email with some links and things like that to you. And we're planning to run more of these webinars, so hopefully it's useful and you get some good value out of it. We're going to have some different topics coming up, so stay tuned for that. We'll be in touch, but thanks everyone for joining today, and wish you well with your culture journey.